The train that could not stop. At 4:17 in the morning, on a cold section of track somewhere west of the Dnieper in the winter of 1944, a Soviet locomotive engineer sat with one hand on the throttle and the other pressed against the metal frame beside him, feeling for movement that should not be there. The engine was breathing in front of him. Not running smoothly. Breathing. Steam hissed through the cold air. The boiler ticked and groaned. Somewhere beneath the cab, iron expanded and contracted with small, tired sounds, like the machine itself was trying to stay awake. The headlamp threw a weak cone of light over the rails ahead, but the beam did not reach far. Beyond it were men with lanterns. Beyond them was a bridge that had been blown open by retreating German engineers and patched through the night by Soviet railway troops with timber, steel, sweat, and guesses. The engineer did not know the names of every man out there. He knew their shapes: bent backs, long coats stiff with frost, hands wrapped in cloth, one man carrying a crowbar, another kneeling by the rail, striking at a spike with short, controlled blows so the sound would not carry farther than it had to. Behind the locomotive were wagons loaded with things no army could replace with courage: shells, fuel drums, flour, medical crates, spare parts, winter coats, signal cable. Men headed toward the front, and wounded men who would be pulled away from it if the line held long enough. The train could not wait until daylight. Daylight meant aircraft. Daylight meant German observers. Daylight meant the possibility that the bridge repair would be seen before it could be used. And so the decision came in darkness, in the kind of hour when even experienced men stop speaking unless the words are necessary. A red lantern moved once. Then again. The engineer leaned forward. His eyes burned from smoke and lack of sleep. His mouth tasted of coal dust and metal. Somewhere in the darkness, a field telephone line crackled, and a voice came through so faintly that no one in the cab could tell whether it was a warning or an order. He waited. The lantern changed. Green. He opened the throttle slowly. The locomotive moved like an animal stepping onto thin ice. The first wheels touched the repaired section. The bridge answered with a low wooden complaint. No one cheered. No one breathed deeply. The workers stood back with their tools in their hands and watched the wheels pass over the place where, only hours earlier, there had been nothing but broken rail and black water. This was the kind of moment that rarely appeared in frontline histories. There were no tanks charging across an open field. No infantry raising a flag. No famous marshal standing above a map with a pointer in his hand. But this moment mattered. If the train crossed, guns would fire tomorrow. If it failed, a division might wait. If enough trains failed, an offensive could lose its rhythm. The German army had understood railroads. It had used them, depended on them, fought for them, and destroyed them when retreat demanded it. German officers knew that an army on the Eastern Front was too large to live from trucks alone. They knew that a broken bridge could become a weapon. They knew that torn rails could buy time. They believed that if they destroyed the railway behind them, the Red Army would slow. And that belief was not foolish. It was logical. It was professional. It was based on everything modern war had taught them. But what they did not see, not fully, was the army of exhausted men and women who followed the fighting with hammers, cranes, shovels, welding torches, sleepers, cable, and locomotives. They did not see the railway crews who turned wreckage back into movement. They did not see how fast a dead line could be made to carry war again. The locomotive rolled forward another few meters. A worker on the side of the bridge lifted his lantern higher, as if he could hold the darkness back by hand. The engineer kept his eyes on the rails. The bridge held. But the real question was larger than one train, one bridge, or one cold morning. If the Soviet front was moving west faster than any army had a right to move through destroyed country, then someone had to be making that movement possible. Someone had to bring the rails back before the war ran out of momentum. And that is where the forgotten story begins. What Germany believed about broken rails. By the time the German army was retreating across the occupied Soviet territories, destruction had become part of its defensive language. A bridge was not only a bridge. It was time. A rail junction was not only a rail junction. It was delay. A locomotive left behind was not simply abandoned machinery. It was a gift to the enemy, unless it was burned, broken, stripped, or thrown useless into a yard of twisted steel. The German army had learned from the first years of the Eastern Front that space could swallow armies. In 1941, German forces had moved east with enormous speed, but even then, every mile made supply harder. The Soviet rail gauge was different from the European standard used by Germany. Captured lines had to be converted. Locomotives had to be found or adapted. Bridges had to be repaired. Depots had to be organized. Roads dissolved into mud. Trucks wore out. Horses died. Fuel disappeared faster than staff officers wanted to admit. Germany had felt the railway problem from the beginning. So when the war turned, when the front no longer moved east but west, German commanders believed they knew what must be done. They would leave behind not territory, but obstacles. They would break the arteries of the Soviet advance. Bridges were demolished. Track sections were removed or warped. Switches were damaged. Water towers were destroyed. Stations were mined. Telegraph poles were cut. Rail yards were turned into fields of wreckage. To the men who ordered this destruction, the logic was clear. The Red Army could advance with infantry and armor, but not indefinitely. Tanks needed fuel. Guns needed shells. Men needed food. Wounded men needed evacuation. Replacement formations needed transport. Ammunition did not march by itself, and fuel did not flow forward through mud. If the railroads were broken badly enough, Soviet pressure would weaken. The front would outrun its own rear. Supply columns would choke the roads. Artillery would pause. Tank armies would wait for fuel. The Germans would gain days, perhaps weeks, perhaps enough time to form a new defensive line along a river, near a city, behind prepared positions. It was a belief born not from fantasy, but from experience. Modern war had become a war of systems. The riflemen still mattered. The tank still mattered. The artillery battery still mattered. But behind them all stood the question no soldier could escape. How does the next load arrive? A German officer looking at a map could trace the answer in black lines. Railways. Destroy the lines, and the map changed. A Soviet army that looked powerful in combat reports could become fragile when deprived of transport. A breakthrough could become a traffic jam. Victory could slow into exhaustion. But the mistake was hidden inside the assumption. German commanders often imagined destruction as a result. The bridge was gone. The line was cut. The station was ruined. Therefore, the enemy had been delayed. The Soviet railway system treated destruction less like a result and more like a condition to be solved. A blown bridge did not mean the end of movement. It meant the start of a race. A torn rail did not mean the line was dead. It meant a repair party had to reach it before the next train was due. A burned station did not mean traffic stopped forever. It meant dispatchers, signalmen, and military transport officers would improvise around the wound until something more permanent could be built. The German retreat turned rail destruction into policy. The Soviet advance turned rail repair into combat. That was the collision. One side believed broken infrastructure would create breathing room. The other side had built a habit of working without breathing room at all. Somewhere behind the front, Soviet railway officers studied reports not with the calm of peacetime administrators, but with the urgency of men reading casualty lists. A bridge destroyed here. A junction blocked there. Locomotive shortage. Track conversion required. Mines suspected. Rails missing. Water supply damaged. Telegraph line down. Each problem was technical. Each one was also tactical. If a railhead moved forward, the army could move. If it did not, the army's muscles tightened. Fuel did not arrive. Shells piled up too far back. Wounded men waited longer. Trucks carried loads they were never meant to carry over roads that punished every axle. The front could win a battle and still lose tempo. German officers knew that, but they underestimated the people whose job was to keep tempo alive. They saw railroads as targets. The Soviets increasingly treated them as weapons. And to understand why that mattered, we have to leave the map table and go down to the track bed, where the war was measured not in arrows, but in rails, bolts, sleepers, and hands too cold to close around a hammer. The men with hammers, spikes, and no glory. They did not look like the men who would decide the movement of armies. A rifle made a soldier recognizable. A tank made its crew part of a famous machine. A pilot climbed into the sky and became a shape people could imagine. But the railway worker, the track repairman, the signal operator, the switchman, the bridge mechanic, these men and women stood beside the war, half visible, often covered in the same mud as everyone else, but rarely given the same place in memory. Their tools were ordinary things: crowbars, spikes, shovels, cable, lanterns, jacks, timber beams, steel plates, wrenches, saws, welding gear, field telephones, grease, coal, wire. Nothing about these objects looked dramatic until the first ammunition train failed to arrive. Then they became as important as guns. The Soviet railway effort during the war drew from several worlds at once. There were military railway troops trained for repair, construction, and restoration. There were civilian railway workers who had known tracks and engines long before the war reached them. There were engineers and mechanics who could read a locomotive by sound. There were women in stations, depots, signal posts, and repair crews, doing work made heavier by the absence of men taken into combat formations. There were local laborers pulled into emergency tasks after liberation, sometimes working in places where their own homes had just burned. They were not all volunteers in the romantic sense. War rarely gives people clean choices. Some worked from patriotism, some from duty, some because the order came and refusal was not an option. Some because the railway was the only thing they knew how to keep alive. Some because an army's need had no patience for private grief. What joined them was not one emotion, but one pressure. The line had to open. Sometimes the line had to open before the bodies had been cleared from beside it. Sometimes before mines had been fully found. Sometimes while German guns were still within range. Sometimes while aircraft searched for smoke and movement from above. Sometimes in rain so cold it numbed fingers around the tools. Sometimes in summer dust, with sweat cutting white tracks through coal-blackened faces. A destroyed railway was never just one problem. A crater beneath the track had to be filled. Rails had to be replaced or straightened. Sleepers had to be laid. Ballast had to be packed. Mines had to be removed. Switches had to be restored. Signals had to be improvised. A water point had to function if steam locomotives were to keep moving. Coal had to be brought forward. Telegraph or telephone lines had to connect dispatchers who were trying to keep trains from colliding in a landscape where normal systems had been shattered. And over all of it hung the invisible discipline of timing. The front did not ask politely for supplies. Consumed them. An artillery unit did not need shells eventually. It needed them before the next attack. A tank unit did not need fuel in theory. It needed it before the enemy recovered. A hospital train did not need a clear line when convenient. It needed one while wounded men were still alive. The railway crews saw this more clearly than many people behind them. They knew a delay of hours could travel forward and become something else. A gun that did not fire, a truck that did not leave, a soldier who did not receive food, a commander who had to postpone an assault because the arithmetic of supply had turned against him. Their war was made of such conversions. Minutes became distance. Distance became ammunition. Ammunition became pressure. Pressure became movement. Movement became victory, or at least the possibility of it. Yet they were almost never the face of the advance. When Soviet formations moved into towns, photographs showed infantry, tanks, flags, crowds. When great offensives were remembered, the language favored commanders and armies, fronts and breakthroughs, artillery barrages and encirclements. The railway crews appeared in the background, if they appeared at all, standing beside tracks that looked ordinary once repaired. That was the strange injustice of their work. Failure was visible. Success disappeared. If the bridge collapsed, everyone knew. If the line stayed closed, commanders demanded answers. If trains piled up behind a damaged junction, the delay spread through reports and staff tables. But if the crew worked through the night and the train arrived on time, the result looked like normal movement. No one hears the sound of disaster that did not happen. And because of that, the men with hammers and spikes became part of the machinery of war's memory, not its central image. But they were seeing something that both propaganda and enemy calculation often missed. They saw that a battlefield was not only where men fired weapons. It was also wherever the next movement could be stopped. A broken rail could be a battlefield. A bridge beam could be a battlefield. A signal wire, half buried in mud, could be a battlefield. And as the Red Army moved west, that battlefield stretched behind the front in a long, damaged line of steel. The danger was not that Soviet armies could not win ground. The danger was that they might win it faster than the railways could follow. Victory was moving too fast. Victory has its own kind of danger. In defeat, an army is crushed by the enemy. In victory, it can be stretched by its own success. The map looks better every day. The arrows move forward. Towns are liberated. Rivers are crossed. Enemy formations retreat. Reports grow more confident. But behind those arrows, the supply line lengthens with a cold patience that no speech can defeat. After Stalingrad, after Kursk, and especially as the Red Army began driving west through the territories Germany had once occupied, Soviet commanders faced a problem that did not look dramatic from a distance. The front was moving. The rear had to move with it. This was not simple. A modern army did not live from what could be carried on a man's back. It ate through weight. Shells for artillery, fuel for tanks and trucks, spare parts, food, medical supplies, replacement weapons, rails themselves, sleepers, coal, bridging materials, signal cable, uniforms, boots. The dead had to be buried. The wounded had to be evacuated. Prisoners had to be moved. New units had to come forward. Old units had to be refitted. Horses needed fodder. Engines needed maintenance. Men needed bread. The Red Army's advance was often described through impact. Artillery barrages, armored thrusts, infantry assaults, German lines cracking under pressure. But pressure had to be supplied. A gun without shells was only heavy metal. A tank without fuel was a bunker with tracks. A soldier without food could still hold a rifle for a time, but not forever. This was the hidden problem. The farther west the Red Army moved, the more every success lengthened the distance between the fighting line and the deep Soviet rear. Roads were often poor, damaged, crowded, or seasonally ruined. Mud could take a truck apart more slowly than artillery, but with equal finality. Snow could hide ditches, mines, broken culverts. Bridges meant for civilian traffic could not always carry wartime loads. German demolitions added fresh wounds to a landscape already exhausted by years of war. Railways were the answer, but the answer itself had to be rebuilt while being used. That was the impossible rhythm. The Red Army needed rail transport to sustain its movement, but the rail lines in newly taken territory were often destroyed, mined, blocked, or built to gauges and conditions that demanded conversion and repair. Railheads had to move forward. Supply depots had to be shifted. Ammunition had to be stockpiled near enough to matter, but not so near that a single air raid could destroy everything. Dispatchers had to manage traffic over lines that had only recently become passable. Every offensive created a chain of questions. Where is the nearest usable railhead? How far must trucks carry supplies from it? Can the bridge support heavy trains? Is the water point restored? Are there enough locomotives? Is the line clear of mines? Can wounded men be evacuated east before fresh trains move west? Can the next attack begin tomorrow, or must it wait for the railway? On a map, these questions were invisible beneath thick arrows. In reality, they shaped the tempo of the war. German commanders had often looked for the moment when Soviet momentum would outrun itself. Their hope was not absurd. Every army has a limit. Even the most aggressive commander must eventually obey fuel, ammunition, and distance. A force moving too fast can expose itself. Its spearheads can become isolated. Its artillery can lag behind. Its supply columns can collapse into confusion. The Red Army knew this danger too. That is why the railway crews mattered. They did not simply repair old infrastructure. They dragged the Soviet rear westward. They turned conquered space into usable space. They shortened the distance between factories and guns, between depots and tanks, between hospitals and the wounded. They made it possible for a battlefield success to become an operational success, and then something larger. But the work demanded a speed that would have seemed reckless in peacetime. Proper repair could wait. A wartime repair often could not. A bridge did not always need to be beautiful. It needed to carry the next train. A track did not always need to be restored to ideal condition. It needed to hold under weight long enough for traffic to resume. A signal system did not always need to be complete. It needed to prevent disaster for the next movement. This was where theory met mud. Railway manuals could explain standards. War asked what could be done tonight. In some places, repair teams worked so close behind the advancing troops that the boundary between rear area and front line blurred. The sounds around them were not those of a safe workshop. Artillery rolled in the distance. Aircraft engines caused men to freeze and look upward. Mines waited under ballast or beside bridges. German stragglers could still be hiding in woods or ruins. The ground itself could not be trusted. And still, the line had to open. The absurdity was obvious. A railway was supposed to be stable, organized, predictable, the symbol of scheduled movement. But on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Railway War became a practice of improvisation under pressure. A timetable built against chaos. A transport system rebuilt faster than destruction could make sense of. Somewhere ahead, infantry waited for shells. Somewhere behind, a locomotive crew waited for permission to move. Between them stood a repair team, kneeling in mud beside a rail joint, trying to make steel obey before morning. The Germans had believed destruction would create delay. What they had not fully understood was that Soviet railroad crews were being ordered to treat delay itself as the enemy. The ridiculous idea, repair under fire. There are rules men invent when they believe there will be time. Do not enter an area until it is secure. Do not repair a bridge until engineers have inspected every support. Do not move heavy traffic over a line until the track has been properly tested. Do not work in daylight if aircraft are near. Do not work in darkness if mines are suspected. Do not improvise where failure means a train full of ammunition might fall into a river. These rules are sensible. War has a way of making sensible things impossible. The idea that Soviet railway crews would move forward almost immediately behind the fighting, sometimes before the ground was fully cleared, sometimes before the fires had gone out, sometimes while artillery could still reach the line, would have looked reckless to anyone thinking in peacetime terms. A railroad was not a trench. A repair crew was not an assault platoon. Track workers were not supposed to gamble with unexploded ordnance, snipers, or air attack. But the Eastern Front was not built around what men were supposed to do. The line had to be opened because the army behind it was hungry for movement. If railway crews waited for perfect safety, the offensive could lose time that could not be recovered. The Germans would dig in. Bridges farther west would be prepared for demolition. Reserves would move. Anti-tank guns would be positioned. A pause of one day in the rear might become a wall of resistance at the front. So the crews went forward. They entered rail yards where the rails bent upward like broken ribs. They climbed over burned wagons and split sleepers. They examined craters filled with black water. They worked around stations whose walls still held heat from the fires. They followed mine-clearing teams with materials already in hand, because waiting until the last danger was removed meant the next train would be late. The men who did this did not need speeches about importance. The evidence sat behind them in sidings and holding yards. Trains ready to move, locomotives under steam, wagons loaded and waiting, dispatchers demanding updates, officers asking when the line would open. One damaged section could hold back a queue. One queue could hold back supplies. The railway system was strong because it could carry enormous weight, but vulnerable because its movement depended on continuity. A truck could go around a crater if the ground allowed it. A train could not improvise a path through a field. Needed rails. Two thin lines of steel, aligned correctly, supported properly, connected without fatal error. That was the fragility German engineers attacked. That was the fragility Soviet repair crews had to defeat. They did it with methods that often seemed crude, but were shaped by urgency. Temporary track bypasses, rapid replacement of rail sections, timber supports, emergency bridge spans, improvised signaling, manual switching, local repairs strong enough for restricted speed. The goal was not always permanent restoration. Sometimes the goal was movement now, improvement later. A locomotive did not care whether a repair was elegant, cared whether the rails held. The crews knew the risk in their hands. A rail joint badly fixed could spread under weight. A bridge support placed wrong could fail at the worst moment. A mine missed beneath ballast could tear open the line as the first train passed. A signal misunderstanding could send two trains toward the same section of track. The battlefield punished small mistakes. And yet, men made decisions because not deciding was also a decision. A bridge mechanic might look at a damaged support and know it should be reinforced again. A transport officer might know that waiting another hour reduced risk. A commander might know that the ammunition train behind him could not wait another hour. Somewhere beyond the line, artillery units were counting shells. Somewhere ahead, tanks needed fuel before the next move. So the question changed. It was no longer, is this safe? It became, is it safe enough to risk because the alternative is worse? That is a grim calculation. It does not fit well into heroic memory. It has no clean shape. It is not a charge. It is not a duel. It is a man looking at steel in bad light and knowing that whatever he decides, someone may pay. There were moments when crews had to work while shells landed close enough to make the ground jump beneath the rails. Moments when the sound of aircraft engines made men scatter into ditches, then return before the dust settled. Moments when a worker lifted a sleeper and found a wire that should not have been there. Moments when the correct response was silence, a raised hand, and everyone stepping backward very slowly. The Germans had believed damaged railways would produce a delay. But under Soviet pressure, railway repair became something closer to an assault. Not against a bunker, against time. And when the first line was patched, when the bridge was braced, when the rails were judged passable by men who knew they might be wrong, the most frightening test still remained. The first train had to cross. One bridge, one train, one offensive. A repaired bridge does not prove itself when the last bolt is tightened. It proves itself when weight comes onto it. Imagine the scene without music, without speeches, without the comfort of knowing the ending. A river below, dark and swollen. A bridge damaged by retreating Germans, its original structure wounded, its replacement supports put in by men working through the night. Timber still raw. Metal still bearing fresh marks. Mud on the planks. Lantern light trembling under the breath of the wind. The repair crew has done what it can. That phrase carries more fear than confidence. What it can. Not what would be done in a proper depot. Not what a peacetime engineer would approve after long inspection. What could be done with the materials available in the time allowed under the conditions imposed by war. Now a locomotive waits at the approach. Its engineer can feel the machine wanting to move. Steam pressure builds. The fireman watches the gauges. The crew hears the small sounds from the bridge, water below, wind through temporary supports, the creak of timber settling into load even before the train arrives. No one wants to be the first, but someone must be. Behind the locomotive, the wagons hold the weight of decisions made far away. Ammunition packed in crates, fuel sealed in drums, medical supplies, rations, perhaps replacement troops sitting on wooden benches, too tired to speak, pretending not to watch the bridge. Perhaps wounded men in another train will move east after this one passes west. The line cannot remain blocked forever. Traffic is waiting on both sides of the war. A signal comes. The locomotive moves. Slowly at first. Painfully slowly. The wheels reach the bridge and the sound changes. On solid ground, a train speaks with rhythm. On a damaged bridge, every sound becomes separate. Wheel, joint, beam, chain, water, steam, breath. The engineer listens because listening is part of survival. A locomotive tells a man things through vibration. The track tells him things through the frame. A bridge that shifts wrong has its own voice. He has known engines long enough to hear when steel is unhappy. The workers stand away from the line. Not far enough to be safe if the bridge fails, but far enough to pretend there is such a thing as safe distance. One man still holds a wrench. Another keeps his hand raised, as if he might stop the train by gesture if the bridge begins to go. The locomotive reaches the center. That is the longest part. Not in distance, in feeling. Every meter seems to ask the same question. Did we miss something? A support bends. Or perhaps it only looks that way in the weak light. A board cracks somewhere beneath the wheels. Someone swears under his breath. The engineer does not increase speed. He cannot stop either. Stopping on the bridge might be worse than moving. Momentum becomes judgment. Too fast and the bridge may suffer. Too slow and the load lingers where the structure is weakest. The train keeps moving. Then the first locomotive wheels reach the far side. The bridge remains. The wagons follow, one after another, each carrying enough weight to renew the fear. The workers do not celebrate after the engine crosses. They wait for the last wagon. They know the last load can kill a bridge as surely as the first. Only when the final coupling clears the repaired section does the air change. A man lowers his lantern. Another sits down on a sleeper and does not speak. The train continues into the dark. This kind of scene happened in many forms across the Soviet advance. Not always at a grand bridge. Sometimes at a culvert. Sometimes over a hastily repaired embankment. Sometimes through a junction where the switches had been rebuilt from parts scavenged out of wreckage. Sometimes past a water tower repaired just enough to keep steam locomotives alive for the next leg. The specifics changed. The pattern remained. A destroyed line. A repair under pressure. A first train. A decision made before certainty existed. And if the line worked, the result was not dramatic from the outside. The train passed. The cargo moved. The railhead advanced. The army continued. That was the quiet power of it. The Germans had destroyed bridges to create pauses. The Soviet crews turned those pauses into temporary interruptions. Every bridge restored reduced the value of German demolition. Every train that crossed carried not only supplies, but proof. The retreating army had damaged the road behind it, but not enough. Multiply that bridge by dozens, then hundreds. Multiply the train by thousands of wagons. Multiply one night's repair by months of pursuit across Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and toward Germany. Then the hidden scale begins to appear. The question is no longer whether one bridge held. The question is how an entire system kept coming back after being broken again and again. The rails came back. From the German side, the return of Soviet railway movement could feel almost unnatural. A junction had been destroyed. Reports said the bridge was down. Tracks had been cut. Mines had been placed. Rolling stock had been removed or wrecked. The line, according to reasonable expectation, should not function soon. Then the Soviet guns began again. Not weeks later. Sometimes sooner than German officers expected. Fresh ammunition appeared at the front. Artillery concentrations resumed. Tank units found fuel. Infantry formations received bread and cartridges. Wounded men moved east. Replacement troops moved west. The pressure returned. This was the reversal at the center of the story. German destruction did hurt the Soviet advance. Created delays. Forced labor. Consumed material and time. Killed repair crews. Complicated planning. Nothing about the Soviet response made railway demolition meaningless. But it made demolition less decisive than Germany needed it to be. A destroyed railway is useful to a retreating army only if the destruction lasts long enough to change the battle. If the enemy repairs around it, if traffic resumes, if the railhead moves forward before a defensive line has hardened, then the demolition buys less than expected. It becomes damage, not salvation. That difference mattered. By 1944, the Red Army had become a force capable of enormous operational pressure. Its artillery could prepare attacks with crushing weight. Its armored formations could exploit openings. Its infantry could sustain hard fighting across difficult ground. But all of this depended on the rear. The railway crews turned battlefield victories into something that could continue. They allowed pressure to repeat. That is what frightened defenders most. An attack can be survived. A breakthrough can be contained if the enemy stalls afterward. A pause gives time to mine roads, reinforce towns, bring up anti-tank guns, reorganize shattered units, repair communications, restore command. But if the attacker's supplies arrive quickly, the pause shrinks. The defender loses the thing retreat is supposed to provide: time. The German army often retreated by destroying space. Soviet railway workers advanced by restoring it. That was the duel few people remember. There are many ways to imagine the Eastern Front in its final years. Tanks moving through snow, artillery firing across rivers, infantry entering ruined villages, commanders bending over maps. But behind those images, rail lines were being dragged forward like veins into wounded territory. Railheads moved, depots shifted, trains entered places where, days earlier, German demolition teams had tried to ensure that nothing would move. In liberated towns, civilians sometimes watched railway crews arrive before normal life had any chance to return. The station might be a burn shell, windows gone, roof collapsed, platforms broken. Yet the military need was immediate. Clear the tracks, remove wreckage, restore a switch, set up temporary control, find water, move trains. Civilian life could wait. War could not. This is one of the harsh truths of liberation. A town could be freed and still not be allowed to rest. Its rails became military space. Its station became a supply point. Its people, if able, might be drawn into the work of movement before they had finished counting what occupation and battle had taken from them. The Soviet railway crews worked inside this moral exhaustion. They were part of liberation, but also part of a system that demanded everything from places already emptied by war. The trains had to move. German officers who studied Soviet momentum could count divisions, guns, tanks, aircraft. But the more elusive measure was restoration speed. How quickly did a destroyed line become usable? How soon after a breakthrough could supplies arrive? How far forward could railheads be pushed before roads became the limiting factor? How much punishment could the transport network absorb before it failed? The answer kept changing because the crews kept working. A single repair was not enough. The railway had to survive repeated attacks and repeated use. German aircraft could strike yards and bridges. Retreating forces could destroy what they left. Weather could undo temporary fixes. Heavy military traffic could strain weak sections. A line repaired in haste might need repairs again after the first waves of movement. So the Soviet response was not one heroic act. It was repetition. Repair. Move traffic. Repair again. Extend. Convert. Patch. Clear. Signal. Dispatch. Load. Unload. Repeat. That repetition does not easily become legend. It has no single decisive explosion. No clean moment where the viewer can say, that is when everything changed. But wars often turn on repetition. One shell arriving is not victory. 10,000 shells arriving at the right time can be. One fuel wagon is not an offensive. A sustained flow of fuel can be. One repaired bridge is not Berlin. Hundreds of restored connections can help carry an army there. The Germans had believed broken rails would slow the Red Army. What really happened was more uncomfortable. The rails came back. And every time they did, the front moved closer to Germany. The mathematics of survival. The power of a train is not dramatic until you imagine replacing it. A freight train could carry loads that would require long columns of trucks, each truck needing fuel, drivers, tires, spare parts, maintenance, passable roads, bridges that could take its weight and time. On the Eastern Front, every one of those requirements could become a failure point. Roads dissolved into mud. Snow covered damage until wheels found it. Bridges collapsed. Engines froze. Convoys clogged narrow approaches. Fuel spent moving supplies became part of the supply problem itself. A train had its own vulnerabilities. It needed rails. It needed water and coal. It needed working signals or disciplined control. Could not scatter when aircraft came. Could not drive around a broken bridge. But when the line worked, the scale changed. That is why railway repair mattered so much. It was not romantic. It was arithmetic. A few meters of rail could decide whether hundreds of tons moved or waited. A restored switch could decide whether traffic flowed through a junction or backed up into confusion. A patched bridge could decide whether trucks carried supplies over ruined roads for days or trains carried them forward in hours. A functioning railhead could shorten the distance between depot and gun line by distances that mattered to every soldier at the front. The numbers do not need to be exaggerated. They only need to be understood. An army consumes weight at a frightening rate. Artillery fire alone could devour ammunition in quantities that seem unreal until one stands beside a gun line and watches shells stacked, carried, fired, and replaced. Tanks needed fuel not only for attacks, but for movement to assembly areas, repositioning, withdrawal, maintenance runs, and training. Infantry needed food daily, not when logistics became convenient. Medical systems needed evacuation routes before wounded men turned from casualties into deaths. Every delay had a physical consequence. A shell that did not arrive could mean a gun stayed silent. A fuel wagon held too far back could mean tanks waited. A delayed hospital train could mean wounded men remained near the front longer than they should. A shortage of spare parts could turn damaged vehicles into permanent losses. The railway crews worked inside this mathematics, whether or not anyone described it that way. They knew the weight of a rail section. They knew how long it took to replace sleepers. They knew the sound of a bad joint. They knew how quickly a locomotive needed water. They knew that a line declared passable at reduced speed was not the same as a fully restored line, but reduced speed was still movement. They knew that movement, however imperfect, was often worth more than waiting for proper conditions. In war, good enough is not laziness. Sometimes it is survival. A repaired rail line did not have to carry normal civilian traffic. It had to carry war traffic. That meant heavy loads, urgent schedules, and little tolerance for mistakes. A train of ammunition could not be treated casually. A derailment could block the line, destroy cargo, kill crews, and create a target visible from the air. Dispatchers had to think not only about what moved, but in what order. Ammunition west, wounded east, fuel west, empty wagons east, troops west, damaged equipment east, coal forward, bridge materials forward, food forward. The railway was not a simple line. It was a pulse. If the pulse became irregular, the whole body of the army felt it. This is why the German belief in railway destruction was rational. Break the pulse and the body weakens. But the Soviet response was to keep restoring circulation faster than expected. Not perfectly, not without waste, not without suffering, but enough to matter. The mathematics of survival were brutal because they converted human labor into operational tempo. A crew working one more hour might open a line before dawn. A locomotive crew accepting one more dangerous run might deliver shells before an attack. A signalman staying at a damaged post might prevent a collision. A bridge team taking a calculated risk might move the railhead forward by a distance that changed the next day's plan. Small actions became large consequences. That is the part of logistics often missed in memory. It looks like background until it fails. Then everyone discovers it was the center. A tank commander may not know the name of the worker who repaired the line that brought his fuel forward. An infantryman may never see the dispatcher who moved the train carrying his rations. A wounded soldier may not know who restored the bridge that allowed the hospital train to reach him. But their lives touched the railway all the same. The Germans believed that the visible weapons decided the pace. Tanks, guns, aircraft, divisions. They were not wrong, but they were incomplete. What really happened was that the pace of war also depended on quiet calculations made in smoke and mud. How much weight, how much distance, how much time, how much risk. And behind every calculation stood a person paying the cost. The human cost of keeping steel alive. The railway war did not leave clean memories. It left hands split by cold, eyes reddened by smoke, men sleeping against toolboxes because there was nowhere else to lie down, women at stations trying to keep records straight while the windows rattled from distant guns, mechanics working inside locomotive sheds where the air tasted of oil, coal, and fatigue, signal workers tracing broken lines through mud. Knowing a cut cable could mean more than inconvenience. There is a danger in telling stories like this too neatly. It is easy to turn every worker into a silent hero and every repair into an act of pure patriotic purpose. The truth was probably harder and more human. Some were brave. Some were terrified. Some were angry. Some were simply too tired to feel anything clearly. Some had lost family to occupation, hunger, bombing, or evacuation. Some were young enough to have learned their trade inside war itself. Some were old railwaymen who had known engines when schedules mattered more than survival. Some did their work because they believed in the cause. Some because the order was there and the line had to open. War does not require people to be pure before it uses them. The cost came in many forms. There was the immediate danger. Bombing raids, artillery fire, mines, collapsing structures, derailments, fires, explosions. Railway targets were obvious to any army that understood logistics. Bridges, junctions, depots, yards, and trains were all worth hitting. A crew repairing a track could be killed by the same logic that made its work important. There was also exhaustion, the slower enemy. Sleep disappeared into fragments. Food might arrive cold or late. Clothing stayed wet. Tools grew heavy. A man could become careless not because he lacked discipline, but because the body has limits no order can abolish. A missed mine, a poorly seen crack, a misunderstood signal. Fatigue could turn any detail into death. Then there was the emotional cost of working where the front had passed. Railway lines ran through towns, villages, forests, fields, and river crossings that had seen occupation and battle. A repair crew might arrive in a place where civilians were still emerging from cellars. A station platform might hold refugees, soldiers, prisoners, wounded men, and workers all at once, each group carrying a different version of the same war. A man could repair a track beside a building where people had died the day before, and the work would not stop for morning. The trains themselves carried reminders. A westbound train might hold shells and men. An eastbound train might carry the wounded, wrapped in blankets, silent or groaning, their faces gray under bandages. The railway worker saw both directions of war, the material going in and the human damage coming out. That double vision is important. Frontline histories often move forward with the attacking army. Railway crews watched the war move both ways. They saw confidence heading west and pain coming east. They saw fresh troops and shattered men. They saw equipment repaired, then broken again. They saw the machine of war feeding itself and returning its wounded parts. No one could mistake that for glory for long. And yet the work continued. There is a kind of courage that announces itself. A charge across open ground. A pilot staying with a burning aircraft. A soldier holding a position after retreat becomes impossible. But there is another kind, flatter and more repetitive, that does not look like courage from a distance. It looks like showing up again. A worker returns to the same track after a bombing raid. A mechanic climbs back into the engine shed. A signal operator repairs the line after it has already been cut twice. A bridge crew strengthens a span they know will be tested before they trust it. No trumpet sounds for these acts. They happen because the next task is waiting. The human cost was also tied to invisibility. Many of these people did work that disappeared the moment it succeeded. A repaired rail looked like a rail. A functioning switch looked ordinary. A train that arrived on time did not announce the danger it had passed through. The evidence of labor was erased by use. That is one reason they became forgotten. Not because they did not matter, because they made movement seem possible again. In official memory, the great images remained elsewhere. The tank in the street, the soldier at the river, the artillery barrage, the flag, the ruined capital. But beneath those images were countless smaller scenes. A man tightening bolts with numb fingers, a woman logging train movements by weak light, a crew clearing wreckage before dawn, a locomotive engineer easing over a bridge that should not have been ready. The Red Army moved west through sacrifice at the front. It also moved west through sacrifice behind it. And when the war ended, when the maps were redrawn and the speeches were given, the question remained quietly unanswered. Who would remember the people who kept the steel alive? Recognition that came late. Official systems are good at counting what they are designed to count. They count divisions. guns, tanks, aircraft, kilometers advanced, prisoners taken, bridges captured, cities liberated, rail lines restored, sometimes in reports that speak the language of transport and achievement. But memory does not always follow reports. Memory follows images. A tank pushing through a ruined street, a soldier waving from a turret, infantry moving past a burning building, artillery firing in a long row, a marshal reviewing troops. These images carry emotional weight. They are easy to understand. They have shape and drama. Railway labor is harder to remember. A restored line looks ordinary. A dispatcher's decision leaves no crater. A mechanic's repair is hidden inside a machine. A signalman's success is measured by the collision that did not happen. A bridge crew's work is seen only briefly, as the train passes and disappears. Some Soviet railway workers and railway troops were recognized. There were awards, commendations, official acknowledgments, institutional histories, and post-war accounts that understood the importance of transport. The Soviet state knew, at least in administrative and military terms, that railways had mattered enormously. It could not have fought the war it fought without them. But public imagination is selective. The closer a person is to the visible violence of battle, the easier it becomes to place them inside the story. The farther they are from the moment of firing, the more their work is treated as support, even when that support makes the firing possible. This is not unique to the Soviet war effort. It is a pattern across military history. Logistics becomes famous when it fails. When it succeeds, it becomes background. That is a cruel form of success. For Soviet railroad crews, the war's end did not transform every repairman into a remembered figure. Many returned to railway work. Some rebuilt peacetime lines out of the remains of wartime ones. Some carried injuries. Some carried memories. Some may have spoken of the war only in practical terms. Where they worked, what was destroyed, how long it took, which bridge was hardest, which winter was worst. The language of such men and women is often plain because the experience was not. They did not need to call it destiny. They called it work. But work can be historic without sounding grand. A report might state that a rail section was restored by a certain date. Behind that sentence were hours of labor, danger, judgment, improvisation, and fear. A line on a logistics table might show traffic resumed. Behind that line were people moving through wreckage, checking bolts, clearing mines, and trusting repairs made under pressure. Delayed recognition often comes when later generations learn to ask different questions. Not only, who captured the city, but how did the army reach it? Not only, which commander planned the offensive, but what allowed the offensive to continue after the first breakthrough? Not only, how many tanks advanced, but who brought the fuel? These questions shift the light. They do not take anything away from the soldiers at the front. They make the story larger and more honest. A rifleman still had to fight. A tank crew still had to enter fire. An artillery battery still had to serve its guns under danger. But none of them existed outside the system that supplied them. The forgotten railway crews belonged to that system. Their recognition came late because their work was absorbed into the apparent inevitability of Soviet advance. Once we know Germany lost, we are tempted to imagine the Red Army's movement west as something unstoppable, almost natural. But nothing about it was natural. Every kilometer had to be sustained. Every river created problems. Every destroyed junction demanded labor. Every advance increased pressure on the rear. The war was not a single wave rolling west. It was a machine being rebuilt while moving. That is why the railway crews matter. They remind us that victory is not only the moment an enemy line breaks. It is also the ability to keep moving after the line breaks, to bring forward the shells, to bring forward the fuel, to evacuate the wounded, to repair the bridge, to run the train again. Germany had believed destruction would turn space into defense. The Soviet railway workers helped turn destroyed space back into movement. And their legacy was measured not only in medals, but in distance. The steel road to Berlin. By the final stages of the war in Europe, the Red Army's movement west had become one of the defining forces of the conflict. Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, the approaches to Germany, rivers, forests, ruined towns, burned stations, shattered bridges. The names on the map changed, but the problem followed every advance. The army could not simply move through space. It had to make space usable behind it. That was the railway crew's legacy. They helped transform conquered ground into operating ground. A battlefield breakthrough is a door opening. Logistics decides how many men and machines can pass through before the door closes again. The Soviet offensives that pushed west required not only force, but follow-through. After the first German positions cracked, supplies had to move fast enough to prevent the enemy from restoring balance. Railways made that possible at a scale roads alone could not match. The final drive toward Germany was not one uninterrupted rush. It was a sequence of operations, pauses, preparations, redeployments, concentrations, and renewed attacks. Before major offensives, supplies had to be built up. Ammunition had to be stockpiled. Fuel had to be positioned. Troops had to be moved. Heavy equipment had to be brought forward. Hospitals had to be organized. Bridges and railheads had to support the weight of what was coming. The railway was the skeleton of that preparation. Without it, the army still had courage. It still had commanders. It still had weapons. But courage does not move thousands of tons. Commanders cannot order shells into existence at the gun line. Weapons cannot fire what has not arrived. The closer the Red Army came to Germany, the more every repaired line carried symbolic weight as well as military value. Trains moving west through territory once occupied by German forces represented more than transport. They were proof that the direction of the war had reversed. The same kind of steel network that had once enabled invasion and occupation was now carrying the force that would end the Third Reich. But the railways did not heal the land they crossed. They passed through devastation, the smoke of villages, the ruins of stations, the remains of bridges, fields marked by shell holes, civilians standing near tracks with faces that did not know whether to hope or fear what came next. War moving west did not erase the suffering behind it. The railway crews saw this. They did not move through a clean victory corridor. They moved through the aftermath of occupation, retreat, battle, and destruction. Their work was practical, but it was also part of a vast transformation of the landscape. A rail line restored for military movement might later become a line of reconstruction. A bridge patched for ammunition trains might later carry civilians. A station cleared for troop traffic might eventually hear ordinary voices again. In the moment, though, there was little room for such thoughts. The next train mattered. As Soviet forces prepared for the last campaigns, the contest between destruction and restoration continued. German forces still demolished, delayed, defended. Soviet repair teams still followed, rebuilt, rerouted, and pushed forward. The closer the fighting came to Germany itself, the more desperate the defensive logic became. Every river mattered. Every junction mattered. Every day mattered. Could destruction slow the Red Army enough? Could repair keep pace with pursuit? Could the steel road be extended fast enough to sustain the final pressure? The answer was written not in one battle, but in the cumulative movement of trains. Trains carrying shells for artillery barrages. Trains carrying fuel for armored formations. Trains carrying men toward the front and wounded men away from it. Trains carrying the material weight of an army that history often remembers through its combat power, but that could not have lived by combat power alone. This is why the forgotten railroad crews deserve a place in the story. They were not an accessory to the advance. They were one of the conditions that made advance possible. They did not decide strategy in the highest councils. They did not command fronts. They did not appear in the most famous photographs. But they helped ensure that when Soviet commanders ordered another movement west, the material of war could follow. The Germans had believed that broken rails would create distance. What really happened was that Soviet crews kept shortening that distance. Rail by rail, bridge by bridge, train by train, until the line of movement stretched toward Berlin. What really moved the Red Army? Returned to the bridge in darkness. The locomotive moves slowly. The engineer listens to the rails. The workers stand back with lanterns, their faces half hidden by steam and smoke. No one knows yet whether the repair will hold. No one knows whether the train will cross cleanly or fall into the black shape of the river below. Behind the engine, the wagons carry all the things war consumes before it admits it is hungry. Shells, fuel, food, medicine, men. The bridge holds. The train passes. And in that small movement, the larger truth of the Soviet advance becomes easier to see. The Red Army did not move west on courage alone. Courage mattered. So did discipline, numbers, command, artillery, armor, air power, and the terrible endurance of soldiers who had already seen more than human beings should see. But none of those things floated above the ground. They had weight. They required transport. They needed rails, bridges, depots, engines, signals, schedules, and people willing to repair what the war kept breaking. Germany had believed destroyed railways could slow pursuit, and in many places they did. German demolitions were not imaginary obstacles. They were real, dangerous, and costly. They killed men. They delayed trains. They forced improvisation. They made every advance harder. But what really happened was that the Soviet railway crews made destruction temporary often enough for momentum to survive. That was their achievement. Not perfection. Not invincibility. Persistence. They worked in places where the smoke had not cleared. They repaired lines under pressure from commanders, aircraft, artillery, mines, weather, and fatigue. They accepted temporary solutions because the front could not wait for permanent ones. They watched trains pass over repairs they had made with their own hands, knowing that if they were wrong, the cost would be immediate. They were not outside the war. They were inside its machinery. And because they succeeded often enough, they disappeared into the movement they created. The tanks kept moving, so people remembered the tanks. The guns kept firing, so people remembered the guns. The armies kept advancing, so people remembered the commanders and the battles. The railway crews became part of the background rhythm. The sound of wheels, the hiss of steam, the hammer on spike, the signal in the dark. But background is not the same as unimportant. Sometimes the background is what keeps the whole scene from collapsing. The forgotten Soviet railroad crews remind us that war is not only decided at the point of attack. It is decided in the spaces behind it, where tired people do necessary work without certainty, often without praise, and sometimes without survival. A repaired rail is not dramatic until one imagines the army without it. A bridge is not heroic until one understands what fails when it does. A train is not merely transport when it carries the next day's battle inside its wagons. They believed broken rails could stop an army. But what really happened was this. As long as the rails came back, the Red Army kept moving. And somewhere in the dark, long before the famous images of victory, a worker lifted a lantern beside a damaged bridge and gave a locomotive permission to cross. Final CTA. If you are watching from a place connected to this history, from Eastern Europe, Russia, Germany, Britain, America, or anywhere touched by the Second World War, share where you are watching from in the comments. And if someone in your family served, repaired, transported, healed, built, or simply endured during the war, you are welcome to leave their story there as well. War is often remembered through the names of generals and battles. But many of its most important stories belong to people whose names were never widely known. If you want more forgotten stories from World War II, told with the seriousness they deserve, subscribe to Warfront Archive. What they believed, what really happened,